Okay, I'm sorry that I can't be here with you today, but you've just finished your quiz over Aristotle's theory of tragedy, and we'll go over those answers when we have the opportunity when I've come back to school. But for the moment, let's just go ahead and cover the theory and the concepts that you should have read. If you have questions, don't forget to write those questions down, and then you can ask me those when I come back, and everybody can understand what's going on in this rather challenging work, the selection from Aristotle's Poetics. Okay, let's start not necessarily where Aristotle starts, but with what I think it's easiest for students to understand, and that is the construction of the tragic hero. So we must ask our question, who is this tragic hero? Because Aristotle's theory stipulates that the hero must have four very distinct qualities or characteristics. And when we're asking who this tragic hero is, we've got four possible answers to the question. No, let me rephrase that. Not four possible answers, but four necessary answers. You're going to find that in his writing, Aristotle is very much like a scientist, like a naturalist. He likes to categorize. He likes to talk about necessary qualities in objects and things that he sees. And in this case, he's seeing a function of literature, a tragic hero. So let's go down them one at a time. First of all, Aristotle states that first and most important, it must be good, it referring to the character in tragedy. I paraphrase this for you. The character must elicit sympathy from the audience. In order for a tragedy to work, the audience has to feel something for the characters involved in it. And that can only happen if the character under the spotlight is in some way good. So if the tragic hero demonstrates some character qualities that we consider to be good, then that tragic hero can elicit that sympathy from the audience. Let's go to the second. Aristotle then says the second thing to aim at is propriety. Propriety may be a term that doesn't really resonate with you, and the follow-up sentences about valor for heroes and so on may not help all that much, but let me explain. The character must possess virtues that are appropriate. So, not only must the character be good, but the virtues that that character presents must somehow fall in accord with their type and position. If any of you is really up on this, you might be thinking that he's edging into some sexist or classist territory here, and I think Aristotle actually is. He might be talking about how a woman should present virtues of nurturing, of care, of family and community, whereas perhaps a man might present virtues of justice or valor, honor, courage. So yes, he says not only must you have virtues, but those virtues must be appropriate to your character. And I'll kind of let you go where you'd like to go with that, extending it out into the possible sexist or classist territories. Third, we must understand that the character must be true to life. And that one's pretty easy to understand. The character must be realistic. So if the character is unrealistic, there's a problem, because the audience can't see the character as having any relevance to their real life. There must be a way in which the audience sitting in front of a tragedy finds themselves transported not into some sort of fantasy magical world, but in seeing a representation of a true world. And if you read Aristotle carefully, you'll find that he continually talks about how tragedies should be representations of true action, of realistic action. So the character must be realistic. Moving on to number 4. The fourth point is consistency. And this I read as just an aspect of good writing. The character must act according to a consistent psychology. So if the character, and it's interesting that Aristotle says this, if the character is erratic, it must be consistently erratic. So if it continues to act in crazy fashion, then it should do that consistently. But if it acts with a singleness of purpose, perhaps it acts out of selfishness, it should do that consistently. It should not make any significant character changes for no reason whatsoever. And I think you could look at a lot of the characters that you've read in literature to see that they are fairly consistent. Here in high school, we try not to give you writing that is poor. So we don't give you stories that consist of inconsistent character. But no, Aristotle's just making a point about good writing. Okay, so to review, let's go back here. We have a character must be good, must elicit sympathy from the audience. That character must contain virtue that is appropriate. The character must be realistic, and the character must be consistent. So we have this very realistic, very consistent, and good and virtuous character at the center of tragedy. And here is our tragedy. So I've shown you our tragic hero right over here, and our audience right over here. We must always realize that a tragedy is a sort of commerce between the audience and the tragedy that unfolds on the stage. Aristotle was concerned not just about text, but he was concerned about the relationship between the audience and whatever is happening on the stage. He realized that they'd be in the same room together, that there would be physical proximity. So we must always consider that when we're talking about tragedy. All right, let's go through some of the terms and see how tragedy unfolds. First of all, we've got this tragic hero who, for one reason or another, specific to the tragedy itself, commits a mistake. He commits that mistake usually because of some sort of ignorance. Commits that mistake not necessarily because he's a bad person, but because he did not understand something. This is Aristotle's hamartia, or tragic flaw, as it's often been defined in modern terminology. Let me write that up here. This is the blight on the hero's character that causes the downfall. So what Aristotle emphasizes very importantly is that the hero's downfall must be caused by the hero, him or herself. Cannot be caused from outside. They must have made a decision, often in ignorance, that leads to that downfall. And of course, his second term related to this is Peripeteia, and Peripeteia refers to the tragic irony. So hamartia could translate as tragic flaw, and Peripeteia could translate as tragic irony. The tragic irony of the hero's story is that he brings these problems upon himself. These problems are not brought out by an outside antagonist. So these are the two concepts. Now, once this happens, once this is in play, Aristotle identifies that this has occurred early on in the story. In fact, in the text that he refers to, and that this picture is drawn from, Oedipus, the mistake is made before the events of the play even open. So that mistake is made and throws into a series of events that are inevitable, like a freight train running out of control. Once that mistake is made, it leads to another event and another event and another event that cannot be stopped. There's nothing that can avoid the disaster that is to occur. So when you're thinking about a tragedy, you should think about a quality of watching this plot that bears on inevitability. One of the qualities of tragedy that works on the audience is the idea that this is unstoppable, that the disaster toward which this tragic hero is aiming cannot be stopped. You know it from the beginning. On occasion, I'll refer to Romeo and Juliet, and I'll do that tomorrow especially, but I'll make a reference here. You know very clearly that Romeo and Juliet will die at the end of the play from the prologue at the beginning of the play. This is Shakespeare's way of almost cheaply introducing the idea of inevitability into the play. Throughout everything that goes on, you know that there is no stopping the disaster that is to come. And there's a sense of fate, a sense of sadness, a sense of resignation that comes over the audience that is unique to tragedy. Aristotle says it is necessary. So we have tragic flaw, and leading to this tragic irony, and an inevitable series of events that eventually winds up with catastrophe. The catastrophe, of course, is the disaster of the play, what some theorists have translated as a reversal of fortune. This means that somebody goes from a very high status, often to a very low status. Now, Aristotle and others have said that this tragic hero works best when he is somehow honored or powerful. Oedipus in his story is a king. Romeo and Juliet are the privileged sons and daughters of wealthy households. Hamlet in Shakespeare's tragedy is a prince. Antigone in one of the plays that some of you will read is basically a princess. These are people of huge status, high status, powerful, envied by others, and the reversal of fortune means that the powerful and enviable become the powerless and pitiable. And Aristotle refers to that as the catastrophe. There's another step of the process. Importantly, after the catastrophe occurs, there is a stage of anagnoriasis. Anagnoriasis, sorry if I'm mumbling that, anagnoriasis, there's no pronunciation of the G. Anagnoriasis involves the tragic hero understanding what has happened. So at this stage, at anagnoriasis, the tragic hero understands the mistake was his, that there was nothing that he could do to solve this inevitable chain of events. And basically he is resigned to his fate. There's almost an acceptance, almost a peace at this point, even though, of course, the peace is extraordinarily painful and I hesitate to be redundant, but tragic. So at this portion, or at this point in the play, everything is ended. Everyone understands what has been happening throughout the entire play. There's a recognition of it, there's an understanding of it, there's almost illumination, understanding. And especially in the play Oedipus, which we are not studying this year, the central character, Oedipus, the tragic hero, reaches enlightenment at the end of the play, an enlightenment that he did not have previously. So this is the function of tragedy as outlined by Aristotle. This is what's going on the stage. Remember, I've drawn this line here to indicate that's what's going on the stage. When we talk about literary theory, we're talking about a theorist accounting for a complex piece of literature, labeling its parts, and explaining not only what does happen in the literature, but what should happen in the literature. So Aristotle primarily uses Oedipus as his text, but he's trying to account for all tragedies. And when we shift to Shakespeare, we'll try to apply Aristotle's theory of tragedy to Shakespeare as well. And then we'll talk about theory of comedy, which will come into our Shakespeare study. But right now, we're understanding Aristotle to understand his target, which was Greek tragedy. So he's accounted for what goes on the stage. We still haven't accounted for what goes on over on this side of the stage with the audience. According to Aristotle, everything unfolding on the stage should have a specific psychological effect on the audience. Aristotle is being an amateur psychologist in about 400 BC, and talking about a psychological reaction that psychologists today accept as granted and sometimes use in their own therapy. Here's how it works. If the play has happened as it should, if everything has gone on, a tragic hero has inevitably brought about his own destruction and fallen from a great height, then the audience should experience the twin emotions of pity and fear. They should pity the tragic hero, and remember, they like the tragic hero. That was the first character quality, was sympathy. And they are afraid because they fear that if this can happen to the greatest of us, then what hope do we have, the lowest in the audience? So pity and fear. They experience this to such an extent that a certain psychological reaction happens that Aristotle called catharsis. It's a term that we use today in a number of different circumstances in terms of psychology and elsewhere, and we often spell it differently. This would be a modern English spelling, but the concept is the same. When you're thinking about catharsis, think about a circuit breaker blowing. If you experience emotion to a certain extent, sometimes you're overwhelmed with it, and it blows out your ability to feel that emotion. So certain psychological therapists believe if you want to purge yourself of negative emotion, then sometimes feeling that negative emotion to such an incredible extent that it kind of blows that psychological circuit breaker will work. Aristotle believed that if the tragedy is constructed as it should be, if this machine works perfectly, then the audience will experience pity and fear to such an extent, they will be so emotionally moved that they'll feel better about themselves. It's almost as if going into the theater is psychological therapy. They're able to exercise and purge their negative emotion in this fictional environment and then go back out into their lives feeling better about themselves because they have undergone some sort of therapy, some kind of emotional psychological therapy within the theater. So, if the whole thing works, then we move throughout the entire function box to a happy audience. So it's not only a thing of beauty and art and literature, as Aristotle believes, but since Aristotle's a naturalist and he's a scientist, he's really accounting for it as sort of a scientific phenomenon, tragedy. And when we talk about this theory, we're going to use it to understand the tragedies that he's focusing on. We'll see how Medea and Agamemnon and Antigone might fit this tragic form. We'll try to find the point at which ananorisis happens, at which the catastrophe happens. We'll try to identify the Peripeteia, the hamartia. We'll try to analyze the tragic hero and see how well it fits with Aristotle's tragedy theory. So there's the concept, mostly abstract, not a lot of application to real-life examples. Our job from here on out will be to apply it to real-life examples, and of course each of you has your own play to focus on. So as you read your play, I want you considering some of these complicated concepts with their fancy Greek names, and you can use the more English translations to help you as well. Don't forget, you should have taken notes, but also I hope that you've written down some questions. And at the beginning of class tomorrow, I will be here and happy to answer those questions for you. That's about all I have for you.